So I did. Thank you guys for submitting your very first check-ins. Remember, these are for participation points. So I'm not going to be a very strict must have every word in there correctly, spelled correctly, etc. My main purpose with these is to make sure that you guys have read the text. Now, to that end, I do want to make sure that there aren't too many off base answers. So if I start to see answers wandering, then I might take a point or two off because I don't know if we're fully getting the content there. But please do, you will find every answer right in front of you in that Oxford history. And again, don't hesitate to share. I'm completely okay with you getting PDFs, scans, pictures, whatever. However you can access that material, I'm totally okay with it. Oh, and the other thing, I saw a lot of slippage with terminology in the first two check-in questions. So I saw a lot of answers that were monophonic and polyphonic for whether one note per syllable is what kind of text setting that is versus what kind of text setting is several notes to a syllable. So I want to clarify what those terms mean. Monophonic just means we have one melody line. That is it. There's no harmony, there's no counterpoint, there's one note at a time sounding. Now, that being said, we can hold that note over several syllables if there is a text, but there doesn't even have to be a text with monophony. Monophony is a texture. In other words, it's the interaction of voices. And in the case of monophony, there's only one part. There's only one melody line. Conversely, polyphony is when we have more than one note sounding at a time, either harmony or counterpoint. So if I'm hearing one note at a time, that is monophony, mono, one. If I'm hearing more than one note at a time, it's polyphony, poly, many, multiple. So those are textures as opposed to methods of text setting. In contrast to texture, let's talk about text setting. Text setting, where I put one syllable of a word underneath one note, so one note per syllable, that would be what we call syllabic or declamatory. Those two words mean the same thing, syllabic, declamatory. If I have many notes to the same syllable, so if I'm chanting sanctus, and I have to sing many notes on the song part of that, if I have to sing many notes for one syllable, then it is melismatic. Does everyone feel good about those four terms? Monophony, polyphony, syllabic, melismatic. If anyone feels the least bit shaky about them, please say something. Okay, fantastic. I think we're feeling good. So let's go on to the fun stuff of today. We are working in the secular world now. So we've been talking about Gregorian chant in the church and the Frankish standardization of liturgical music. Now, let's talk about the type of music that was being made by another estate. We said our three estates were clergymen, nobles, peasants. Peasants, we don't have stuff written down for. Clergymen, we already talked about. Now let's talk about what the nobles were doing. And that is, hey, go on. Okay, this stuff. So troubadour and trouvère, and those troubadour and trouvère, that's the same exact thing. Troubadours are trouvères and vice versa. The only difference between troubadour and trouvère is one is a word that comes from southern France and the other word comes from northern France. So troubadours are from southern France And that term also got adopted in Spain and Northern Italy. So that is geographically the more wider used term. But in Northern France, the same exact type of performer was called a trouvère. Everyone with me on that. There is no difference between a troubadour and trouvère. Those are just different languages for the same thing. Feeling good. Excellent. Okay, thank you all. So where those words come from is what we call langue d'oc, which is Southern French or Provençal, versus langue d'oïl, Northern French. And oc and oui, as you may guess, are just the ways of saying yes in each of those languages. So the modern French oui comes from that Northern French oui. Sorry, my medieval French diction is less than perfect, but I think you get the idea, right? We label these languages by the way they say yes. So Southern Provençal French would call these musicians troubadours in the Languedoc regions. Northern French would call these musicians trouvères in the Langue d'oïl region. Both mean finder. Why finder? They're not seeking out anything. They are not the Goonies with their map to One-Eyed Willie's treasure. What they are doing, it's a word for inventing. They are called finders because they invent melodies and text. Finding and inventing were synonymous in medieval French languages. So to call someone a finder, i.e. a troubadour or trouvère, means that you're calling them an inventor of music. So we can get a sense of these musicians' function based on the language we used to label them. And these were important musicians because they were working so closely with the nobles at court. These musicians, relative to other members of society, yes, Will. Oh no, okay, you were just waving to someone. Okay, gotcha. I thought that was a, hey, I have a question, stop for a minute. Okay, so relative to other members of society, these musicians did have freedom of speech and political influence because they were working so closely with the nobles. And surprisingly enough, some of these troubadours and trouvères were actually born commoners, but they were recognized for their talent. And so they were adopted into the court and actually grew to have a very high status. Keep in mind, just like we talked about on Monday, musicians are still servants in this social structure. Musicians are still artisans, craftsmen, fulfilling specified obligations. It goes back to that functionality of music. But in fulfilling those functions, these sometimes common people could exert greater influence through their art. Now, what were the troubadours and trouvères? Whoops, sorry, that's the wrong button. What were they speaking or singing about? This thing called courtly love or fin amour. And it's a specific type of romantic love. Not all romantic love is courtly love. Courtly love is a very specific type of romantic love. When there is a difference between the social or class status of the lover and the beloved. So in other words, the lover puts the beloved up on a very high pedestal. She is a very noble figure. She is a very delicate, refined, elevated influence. And he, on the other hand, I am but a humble, common worm, and I am not worthy of you, blah, blah, blah. To go along with that, this love is never consummated. The lovers never end up together in courtly love because of this social or class difference. They cannot ever have the happy ending. They both recognize, lover and beloved, both recognize that this is not a thing that can be. and the lover sings about it only for the sake of the love itself. He knows he can't win her. But it's just, oh, this love is so strong, I must sing of it. Does everyone feel okay with that concept?
I have a question. So to be more specific about it, like let's um, they're singing about someone that they like an individual that they are wanting to be with and everything. Would they, when they did those songs, would they make them very like generic and broad open, but they knew, and maybe the person they loved knew what they were talking about, but because of who they were singing about, they had to keep it very um they couldn't be very specific and everything because of what might happen?
It very well could be that way. Sometimes the troubadours and trouvères were singing about someone very specific in their life. So if we look at some of the poetry written in that time, we can see that it's addressed and dedicated to specific, and this is usually dedicated to women, not to say that women couldn't create things. And in fact, we are going to listen to a trouvère song by a woman shortly. But yes, sometimes the music and poetry could be dedicated to a specific noblewoman, and that is the troubadour saying, yes, ma'am, I love you, blah, blah, blah. Now, that being said, there's also politics at play. So sometimes a troubadour may be flattering this noblewoman with the recognition that, like, oh, maybe she'll give him some extra money, or maybe she'll convince her husband to give him some new land, something like that. So these pieces of art could be very much dedicated to specific women. That being said, they also didn't have to be, because courtly love was such a widely recognized trope. Much like NSYNC and the Backstreet Boys can just sing about Baby, and it doesn't matter who Baby is. It's just whatever chick they happen to be enamored with that day. That's kind of how courtly love could work too. Because these tropes were so common, it could be, let's just write about a lovely elevated woman and do this art for art's sake. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Fantastic. Any other questions about courtly love before we go on here? Okay, so again, you're elevating the beloved, focusing on their virtues. Because of these tropes, originality in this poetry is not necessarily valued. You don't have to come up with a new idea because everybody already knows courtly love. Audiences wanted to be familiar with the subject matter, but enjoyed hearing new twists on the same basic themes. Hallmark movies, anybody? Like, this is exactly the same thing. We all know the plot, and yet somehow millions of people every year tune in to see what the latest businesswoman who goes back to the country to settle some family feud, who she finds love with then and there. So this idea that we know the story, we know the outcome, it's not originality that's valued, it's how you tell the story. So that's what's important in troubadour and trouvère song. The way these are written, texturally, let's talk about the texture of these. We usually have a solo voice with instrumental accompaniment. And we talked on Monday about, the openness of arranging medieval music. Like, it's not written in the score, this has to be played with a certain instrument, or you must use this many VLs to accompany it. No, that's really open. But we do know that troubadours and trouvères were either expected to accompany themselves, usually with a lute, or to have an ensemble accompany them. So we'll talk more later in class about the types of instruments that are used. But I do want you to know that this music is solo voice with some kind of instrumental accompaniment. Now, that solo voice could use extensively borrowed or reused melodies. These melodies could be shared, and there was no notion of intellectual property because, well, I mean, A, there's no copyright law to enforce it, but B, they wouldn't have considered copyright law necessary because once a melody was out in the world, it was common property. Once the finder invented the melody, it was there for all to use. So there is this extensive sharing of melodic material, and each minstrel, each troubadour or trouvère would put their own spin on it. Now, what forms do these melodies take? And when I say form, we all know what form in music is, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So the forms that troubadour and trouvère song took were the canso, and that is 5 or 6 stanzas with what we call an envoy. In other words, this repeated line of music that keeps coming back at the end of every stanza. So I have a stanza where the words, the music stays the same each time, but the words are new with each stanza. And at the end of each stanza, I have this little envoy, maybe I'll just 1 or 2 lines of music that, or music and words that come back repeating each time. That feel good to everybody? We all understand what a canso is? I'm gonna assume that's a yes. Then we also have the danza or ballada. As you can probably tell from that word, it is a dance with refrain. So the difference between a danza or ballada with refrain is that the part that comes back and is the same each time, that's no longer 1 or 2 lines. That's its own separate section. Today, we might think of it as verse chorus form, where you've got a verse and then a chorus that comes back. It repeats same music and lyrics each time it repeats. Does that feel good to everybody? The difference between a canso and a danza.
Yep.
Excellent. So basically what we have are repetitions of short blocks and repetitions of long blocks with refrains added in. Also, some of these troubadour songs could be through composed, no repetition at all, much like the Gregorian chant, where it's just beginning to end. You've got new notes for each word that comes up. Common topics in the troubadour song. Now, we said they're all fitting into, well, not all, for the most part, they're fitting into this ideal of courtly love. And they can address courtly love from a variety of standpoints. One of the most common is a pastorella, which is a knight and shepherdess. Pastorella meaning shepherdess, like you're out, you're taking the flocks out to pasture. Pastorella, shepherdess. So a knight comes up and romances this shepherdess. These could actually be a little saucier. Pastorellas tended to flirt with a lot of double entendres. You could also have a jeu parti or a débat or a tenso. Those are 3 words that mean the same type of song. What these are intellectual debates, usually on love. So in other words, instead of talking about the love that you feel, you are having an intellectual discussion on love itself. You could also have what we call an alba. An alba is the Latin word for dawn. And that is when a night watchman breaks up the lovers at dawn. So he sees the whole serenade, the night watchman comes along and sees the whole serenade thing. Oh, it's, you know, sun's coming up, gotta get going. That's another type of way they could address courtly love. And chansons de geste, those are songs of deeds, so narratives. And romances, very similar, also narratives. Does everyone feel really comfortable with the differences between those types of songs? Okay. So let's listen to our first example. And like I said, Whoops. There's the window. Okay, like I said, this one is actually by a woman. So let's look at how courtly love plays out when there is a woman speaking or singing. So La Comtesse de Dia was actually what we call a troubadouresse, a female troubadour. So again, same thing, just feminine rather than masculine. Troubadour is a guy, troubadouresse is a gal. So La Comtesse de Dia was a troubadouresse, and we know about her through what we call her vida, which means life or biography. A lot of these troubadours, when their music was written down, they would actually write little biographies to accompany it and, you know, tell the stories behind writing each song. So in that sense, these are great sources of documentation about not only courtly life in the Middle Ages, but these specific people. So we know about La Comtesse de Dia from her Vita, and this is a canso from that Vita. So remember, canso form means it is strophic, and at the end of each strophe, each stanza, we have that envoy. In this case, she calls it a tornata, and it means the same thing. It just means return, or what we might think of as a refrain. It's got a very simple rhyme scheme, and you can contrast the simplicity of the rhyme scheme with, you know, the relative freedom of the musical form. Could you reiterate what's true? Oh, sure. Strophic is another word for verse. So if I have music that keeps coming back, but the words are different each time, then I have a strophic song. Each strophe is a verse, also called a stanza. So every time the music comes back with a new set of words, that's a new strophe. Does that feel good?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so this is strophic with, and now here's the little complexity that makes it a canso. At the end of each of those verses, there's like a couple lines that come back and are the same each time. So that's what makes this a canso as opposed to simply strophic. And there is a simple rhyme scheme. Like I said, you can contrast that simple rhyme scheme with the more layered, more structured musical form. And that musical form includes alternating what we call open and closed endings. Now, open and closed endings in the medieval ages are roughly equivalent to what we would call half and whole cadences. Not entirely the same, because remember, there is no functional harmony in the Middle Ages. They're not working with tonic dominant. That's not how they think. But it is this idea that open cadences land on a note that wants to go to the final. So maybe the second degree or the leading tone. Closed endings land on the final. So we can think of them as roughly equivalent to our half and whole cadences, but they would have called them open and closed endings. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. And of course, courtly love. Now, how does courtly love work when it's the woman singing? This is going to be slightly different. First of all, it would have been undignified for the woman to elevate the man above herself. I mean, let's not even touch the problematic misogyny inherent in medieval society, but there's this idea that the woman must be of the higher class. And so she, as the troubadouresse, cannot fawn over a guy who is above her in social station. So she has to work around that. She has to focus on just her personal subjective experience rather than the relationship between the two. And remember, in courtly love, a relationship is never consummated. It can never have a happy ending. It's just simply love for love's sake. So she's focusing on the love rather than the relationship to the beloved. She's not necessarily singing about him. She's avoiding describing him. She's avoiding addressing him. She is just saying, ah, I feel this love and it hurts. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so let's listen to this. And what I want you to ponder as we listen, and this is a big question, but it can take, the answers can take many forms. How on earth is this different from the chant we've been listening to thus far? We've been talking about ethos. We've been talking about sacred music. We've been talking about functional things that are part of the liturgy. How on earth is this different? And you can take that in any direction you want. Okay, so we got to hear the first couple strophes. How is that different? And we can answer that in a lot of ways.
I think there's like added instruments in there as opposed to just like voices they've been listened to previously.
Absolutely. So this is polyphonic. This is more than one note at a time. How were those instruments being used? What were they doing? Anybody
Some
feel
of it
free.
was just, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just saying anybody should feel free.
Oh, I was saying some of it was kind of just pedal tones, like they would be playing the string like really rapidly just on the same note though.
Exactly. And not only were they plucking that, not only were they using that little tremolo there, they were just holding, the bowed strings were holding a drone, right? So this idea that the voice just floats above it. And if you look in your scores, I mean, there's not rigid accompaniment there, right? It's not looking at Mozart or Beethoven when we've got layers and layers of stuff going on at once. It's just creating an ambience over which the voice can float. What else do you notice? What else is different? And let's while we're talking about instruments, let's stick on how these instruments are used for a minute.
I think the instruments gave like a really good like downbeat, I guess. I don't really know like if there's a time signature in this type of music, but before like the earlier piece, like it didn't really have like a specific flow to it, but it was giving a downbeat in this one for the singer to like move off of.
Yes, yes, there were these points of unity. And then the singer could go off and be a soloist, right? Exactly. So that's something to consider too. Remember, there's really not a good way of notating rhythm yet. Composers can, these troubadours and trouvères specifically, can give us an idea of the proportions they want their notes to take. But we don't necessarily have a 100% concrete metrical way of dividing beats. So yeah, there's what happens then is, like Maya observed, we have these moments of lining up, and then the singer can again go off and be a soloist and take their freedom, use their liberty. Good. How about embellishments? Look at your score. Do you see any of those embellishments that we just heard? Should I go back and play a little, at least that instrumental introduction again? In the Oxford Anthology. This is Oxford Anthology Volume 1. So again, let me throw the question out there again. If you look at that score, do you see any of those embellishments notated in there? Does anyone have the score?
I have the score. I'm just looking for it. I can't find it.
Okay.
Give me a second.
It should be right near the beginning.
Sorry, it took me a second to find the right page, but I think I'm on the right one now, and I don't think any of those embellishments are written in it. I think those are added in.
Precisely. Those are all the choices of the performers. If you ever perform this kind of music, and not just medieval, but this will go through the Renaissance as well, you have the freedom to basically just use the melody that's there as a starting point and make it your own. And in fact, you would be expected to at a medieval court. If you couldn't do that, then you were a lousy musician. If you could not invent on the spot, then you were not worth your salt as a performer. So you can see what the troubadours and trouvères are writing down is quite simple. What do we actually see on that score? Can someone describe for me what the score actually consists of?
just looks like a whole bunch of note heads. Nothing has stems. Like you said, there's no way to really indicate rhythms. There's some slurs, and that's about it.
Precisely. So we've got some ways of the slurs help us to phrase things. And in fact, those wouldn't have been part of the original notation. That's a modern addition. Really, all we have are the note heads, the melody. And musicians are free to do whatever they want around that. So literally, troubadours are just giving us the skeleton, and performers have to put the flesh on that. So I want to really reiterate that and relate it back to what we were saying at the end of Monday. Arranging music is a sketchy proposition because there are so many ways we can do it, and so many ways that could be correct according to what parameters you use and how you define correctness. Does that make sense to everybody? Excellent. Okay. So let's go on. Later troubadours, so troubadours after La Comtesse de Guia, started to subscribe to Time Magazine. No, I'm kidding. Started to subscribe to this specific, very rigid structure of forms called the formes fixes, or the fixed forms. So it's a cognate. If you know formes fixes, you'll understand these are rigid structures that do not deviate. There are 3 formes fixes: the ballade, the virelai, and the rondeau. And we'll talk about what each of those are in just a second. But all of these are variations of bar form. And bar form is A, B. In other words, I have one section of music, then that section of music repeats A, and then I have another section of something new, A, B. So first section repeated, second section. Does that make sense to everybody? That's bar form. Awesome. Okay, so all 3 of these formes fixes are variations on that bar form. So a ballade is A, B, C. Now notice some of those letters are lowercase and some capital. Lowercase letters mean the music repeats, but not the words. So in other words, the music comes back with different words, kind of like we were talking about strophes and verses. So if the music comes back with a different set of words, I use a lowercase letter. Anytime the music and the words repeat together, I have a capital letter. So with ballade form, what I'm seeing is a section of music with words. That section of music repeats with new words. Then I have an entirely new section of music. And then I have a third section that comes back at the end of each larger strophe. So we can see how that's the ballade is mostly most directly related to the canso, because that capital C is basically like our envoy or tornata. Okay. Oh, wait, it says participants can now see your application. Were you guys unable to see my PowerPoint before?
No,
I
we
could
have
see it.
I was able
Okay.
to.
Weird. No, we can see. Good, good. Okay. Thank you guys. I don't know why it sends me weird messages like that. Good. Okay, so that's the ballade. Does everyone feel good about the ballade? Thank you, Andres.
So on the ballade, the C section is still different words, right? Than the other 2.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
So
correct.
why is it capital C
Because
if
every
the C hasn't come yet? If that makes sense,
because every time that C comes back, the words will be the same. So when the A's come back, they'll have different words.
Oh, so that's not the whole song. It's like A B C A B C A B C like multiple times.
Precisely. Yes.
Okay.
Good. Now, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Excellent. Yes, this is just one verse of a ballade. Sorry, guys. Yeah, these are the forms for for each verse of that form fix. So the next form fix is the virali. Again, capital letters mean words and music both returning. Lowercase letters mean just the music, but with new words. So virali is capital A, then a new section of music. That section of music repeats with new words. That's our second V. And then the music from that first section, that first A comes back, but with different words. So I have each verse of a virali starts out with the same words and music. Then I go on to a new section of words and music. That's my first B. The second B comes where B music repeats with new words. And then the last little A, where I have the original music again, but with new words this time. Does the virali make sense to everybody? Excellent. Okay, now here comes the big boy, the rondo. The rondo was by far the most common of the form speaks. And in fact, most historians estimate that about 70% of the troubadour songs in the form speaks were rondos. So if you know rondo, that's the big one. Most of the songs you will find are rondos. What on earth is this mess in front of us? What happens is we get an A section and a B section. Okay, simple enough so far. Then we go to that little A. And what happens in the little A is that the music from the original A repeats with new words. So I have the same music, but now a new set of words with it. After that, I hear the original A with words and music again. It's like, no, it's different from the rondo we see in music today. Because rondo in as the way we understand it, stemming in the classical era, is that we have a chunk of music, something different. The chunk of music returns, something different. Chunk of music returns, right? A, B, A, C, A. And then you can expand that into a 7-part rondo if you like. But this is, yeah, nothing like Mozart's Turkish March, no. Because like in the Mozart, we have that that keeps coming back, right? That's our A section of that rondo. This rondo is different from that kind of thing. Everyone feel good? Okay. So I have that original A section, the original B section, then my little A. That's, let me get my cursor on here so we can, okay. My little A. The music from this section comes back with new words. After that little A, I hear the original section, words and music both repeated. Then again, in this little A, I hear the music with new words again. So really in the middle of a rondo, I'm hearing the same musical phrase 3 times. The difference is this little A has different words from the beginning. This big A has the same words as the beginning. And this little A has different words from the beginning. Then I hear a B section. So I have the music from that first big B with new words. And this will, oh, guys, if only it went home far away from us. And then we wind up the rondo by repeating both A and B sections from the beginning. Words and music are the same. Do we all feel good about that? Okay, and we can all see how these are variations of bar form AAB if we look at the strophe laid out. So AAB with a little tag on the end that keeps repeating. Here I have my AAB, but with the big A in front of it. So that comes first. Here, my bar form is split up by these big sections. So we can see how these are variations of bar form. And this is just embellishment. Does everyone feel good about these forms?
You might not have an answer for this question, but like, why did they do it like that? Like, why did they have it ordered in that way?
Correct, I do not. As for why, I do not know. But bar form in general was popular across the continent of Europe. So this is basically the French taking something that was universal and trying to put their spin on it.
I just meant like the rondo specifically. Like, why did they want to have like, for example, like 3 A sections in a row? You know?
That is a good question. Because they had nothing better to do with their time. No. I wish I had an answer for why. I do not know why. They weren't into writing down their reasons very much. They were into writing down times, dates, places. So for instance, the picture that I have at the beginning in this first slide here, this is it. There we go. A troubadour by the name of Geoffrey Rudel. Opera fans, you may know him from Kaya Sariaho's L'Amour de Loin. That's the main guy in that opera. But Geoffrey Rudel, we know a lot about because he left an extensive vita. And so we know his exploits based on that vita. They were really into documenting their deeds. They were not necessarily into philosophizing. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It was just funny because like it looks so specific that it looks like it's super intentional. But then when you look at it, you're like, it's not symmetrical, and like the pattern isn't like repetitive in the sense that like it goes like in a certain pattern, you know what I mean? It's just like, but it seems so like intentional. I don't know.
It is, because like, why on earth would they put 3 A's in a row? And yet, let me go back to that slide here. There's my form space. There it is. Why, if there's no symmetry, is there like, we've just got this meandering little randomness? That's a good question. I'm sure there's a thesis on it somewhere. But in terms of the actual building blocks, do we feel good about how these blocks fit together? Excellent. Okay, so let's look at one of them in action. So Adam Della Hala left us this beautiful troubadour song. Yeah. And he was both a poet and composer. Now that's pretty common for troubadours because remember, they're writing their own texts and they're setting their own texts to music. So he is both poet and composer. That may feel odd to us today because we separate those functions unless you're Cole Porter. But yeah, this was a unified artwork. He structures this with note against note harmonies. That's a very specific type of texture that we see emerge at the University of Paris. And we're going to talk about the Notre Dame School of Polyphony next time. So track this, please. Keep this in your head for the next few days, that this is a specific type of counterpoint he learned in Paris, and it's unusual for trouvères. Most trouvères did more what La Comtesse de Dédé did, where you have your melody and you were free to do whatever you wanted with that melody. But Adam Della Hala, because he was so highly trained, he's bringing in that Parisian counterpoint to his secular music. There is rather folkish subject matter. So even though it's a courtly art, we should be aware of the social politics at play here. This is a courtly person singing about peasantry. So there's this like romanticization, this idealization of the simple life, the country folk, aren't they so pleasant? Keep that in mind as we're listening. The form that we see is the virili. Now, in your anthology, if you look at this section in your anthology, it gives you all 3 forms of song composed by Adam Della Hala. We're just looking at this virili. So remember, the form of our virili is A, B, B, A. So I should see one section, new section, new section, music repeating without the same words. So that's the form we're looking at with Fine Amoretes. And the thing that I want you to consider is actually very related to what we were just discussing. Why is this form useful, either for the composer or the listener? What's useful about it? Why would this be a desirable thing to structure our music? Okay, so here's Fine Amoretes, and I'm asking you to think about why this form would be useful.
Fines amoretes edia sine secale vere, ormandere maniet, qui quende Joliet, esse si savarus et castani remopore fi.
Okay, so there's our first strophe. We heard the A, B, B, A, as Harold Hill desired. Oh boy. Okay, so why might that form be useful?
Easy
It
to
remind-
remember.
Oh,
Oh, duke it out, everybody.
No, go
I
ahead.
was going to say it reminds me of, if anybody has read things like the Iliad or the Odyssey or the Epic of Gilgamesh, it actually reminds me of kind of an epic form. When you're talking about things like the ABBA form, as you were saying, it brings us back to this point of memory. You have these forms in order to help the poet and the composer, because they're both a poet and a composer, obviously, demonstrate that, like, yeah, I have this down. This is kind of epic music and poetry.
Spot on. We talked about last week how music and text can aid the memorization of each other. So if I have text and I put notes to it, that helps me memorize the text. Vice versa. If I have music and I put words to it, that helps you memorize the music. And Ashley's really correct here. The two are working in conjunction. That's why we have certain parts of repetition and certain parts of newness. Great point.
I was just gonna say that the forms help, like, with memory as well, or repetition, like specifically, like if you have like if you have notes in an A section and then another A section, it comes back and you recognize the notes from when you heard it the first time, it can help you remember it. So
Absolutely. So this is an oral tradition, right? For many of the listeners, though not for the troubadours themselves. They were able to write down their music, clearly. But their audiences were digesting this completely orally. So if I'm a troubadour and I'm strolling around the court trying to entertain these noblemen, and I give them an easily memorizable little chunk of music, then they have that in their head now. And when that little chunk of music comes back, hey ho, they can sing with us next time. So this is also a way of getting the group participating too. As Nathan points out, yeah, once I have it in my head, it's easy for me to sing along every time I recognize it.
Also, what's interesting about it is that if the music does seep out to the general public, like to like, I don't really know what else to call them, the peasantry, as like you said, the other class, like, then they can make up their own verses because they can, if they know the notes and they know that it like repeats in a certain format or whatever, they can just use the same notes that they've heard, but then make their own words.
Very much. And that's one way folk songs happen, right? Is they hear snatches of melody and then maybe they don't remember it exactly, but they remember enough of it that they have a general sketch. And so they turn that into their own thing. They might fill in the spots that they've forgotten with their own creations. That's why if anybody's super into Celtic music and you've heard of something called the child ballads, that's what happens. Is like there's a guy named Child, of course, who went around collecting all of this folk balladry, and he noticed that people were basically riffing on the same few stories, but because they were being passed around orally, they didn't exactly match up. And each of the people telling their version of the story had learned slight variations to fill in the gaps of memory. So that's exactly the same thing that's happening with folk music. When this stuff trickles out of the court into the peasant world, they're doing the exact same thing. Does that make sense to everybody? Fantastic. Any other thoughts on Fine Amoretis before we go on? Okay, so let's go back. Okay. So I do want to practice identifying a couple of chansons. Let's just look at what these forms look like when we lay them out next to each other. So I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint and I am going to share instead. There's a dissertation by a woman named Helen Marshall Gibbons. And she has worked extremely hard to collate many of these troubadour and trouvère songs and notate them in modern notation for us. So let's look at a few of these and see what they look like laid out on paper in modern notation. So I want to go page 54. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Fantastic. Okay, let me resize this so we can see the whole sheet of music. Is that too small? Can we all see it? That might be too small. Oh, this is the part where I really wish we had a nice big screen in a room together. Okay, how's that? Does that help? Hard to read the notation. Okay, let me resize it then and I'll just scroll in real time. Okay, how's that for everybody? Is that better?
Much better.
Yes, that's a lot better.
Fantastic. Okay, so let's look at what's going on here. I have a piece by Guy Banchois, and I see a first section, Dieu angoissus, and that phrase continues all the way through here. So there's my A section. Then my A section repeats, but with different words this time. Langue, sens, fin et vie. So I've got an A section, then another A section with different words, and that ends with this second ending here. Then I go on to something new. So I've got a B section that stretches and stretches and stretches until here. There's the end of my phrase, right? And I see a phrase at the very end. And if I look at the text, oh wait, where's my text is above here. If I look at my text, that last phrase repeats each time. That esse ne puis repeats in each stanza. So if I've got an A section that happens twice, then a B section, and then finally a third section that keeps coming back after each strophe, what form would I have?
Is that the ballad one?
Precisely, that is a ballade, because I've got
It's ballad,
a,
yeah.
we Frenchify it, but if you say ballad, it's, you know, not a big deal. I've got my little A, my little A, my little B, and a big C that keeps coming back at the end of each stroke. So that one's a ballade. Okay, let's take a look at just one more. Here's a short one, much easier to see, yes? I'll take that as a yes. Okay, so let's look at what this one is. I've got my first section. It keeps going and keeps going and keeps going. It's a rather extended A section, yes? Then I've got something new, a B section, numbered 2. And that goes here, and then I repeat my B section. So part 3 happens. So part 3 is another B section with new words. Then I go to the beginning again. Section 4 is the A music again, but with different words. So I have a little a for section 4. And then finally, in section 5, I repeat the A over again, same music and same words. So if I have A, B, B, A, what form would that be?
Virali.
Virali, precisely. So we've just seen 2 of these Formspeaks in action. Does everyone feel good about that? Okay, so let me clear these out of the way. Let me go back to the PowerPoint. Does anyone have questions on the Formspeaks before we move on? Okay. Let's also talk about, oh, come on now. How this stuff got used in the larger culture. Many of these later troubadour and trouvère songs were often part of larger manuscripts that contained the Vedas or other fictional narratives. So like, they weren't novels yet, but it's the same idea where you make up a story and put in songs to fill it. Or they could be intellectual discussions where the songs illustrate intellectual points, like we talked about that debat or that tenso. So these could go along with academic treatises. And it's almost like watching a musical now, where you have a story commented on by the music. One big example of this is Adam de la Halla's Le Jeu de Babin et de Marianne. Not about Robin Hood, even though it's Robin and Marion, not quite Robin Hood, but it's a large scale epic story accompanied by many of his troubadour songs. In the same vein, we have what's called the Roman de Fauvel, which was a huge long poem by Gervais de Bus. And in the manuscripts of Roman de Fauvel, we see him incorporating motets by Philippe de Vitry and Guillaume de Machaut, both of whom we'll talk about shortly. So these things got incorporated into larger scale works. Now that's all going on in France, but Europe is bigger than France. So let's talk about what's going on in Germany. Well, we go from a progression of Minnesänger to Spruchdichter to Meistersinger in Germany. Now, the Minnesänger was a type of performer active in the 12th and 13th centuries, and they sang only about courtly love. Every Minnesang was about courtly love. And we can very rarely say in history that all of something is something, but all of Minnesang is about courtly love. And this was a tradition that arrived in Germany from northern France. So we can see the troubadour culture bleeding over, or I should say trouvère culture bleeding over into Germany. And Minnesang is a courtly art. This was minor nobility, depending on patronage from court performances. Now, the Minnesang was always in bar form. So this was pure AAB. And they called this, the A sections were called Stollen. So each A is a Stolle. And together, those both A sections are called the Aufgesang. And the B section is called the Abgesang. Now, the length of the B section was really variable. It could be a single phrase, or it could basically be its own independent section. So the length of a bar form was really, really variable. But it always consisted of those three parts: two Stollen, which are together called the Aufgesang, and the B section, the Abgesang. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, if we feel good about that, let's ratchet it up a notch. After the Minnesingers had their heyday, there were these things called Spruche. And Spruche were religious songs, not about courtly love, but they often sounded a lot like love songs because they were usually, addressing either the Virgin Mary or perhaps another saint. And these Spruche were more serious and contemplative in nature. They were by highly skilled poet singers who made the art very venerable. And in fact, the leading practitioner of this Spruche, so in other words, the leading Spruchdichter, was a guy named Frauenlob. Now, his real name was Heinrich von Meissen, but he was called Frauenlob, meaning, the lover of women, because he would write these songs to the Virgin Mary. And he was a pivotal figure in bringing Minnesang and religious Spruche together. Once these things blended, we see a phenomenon called the Meistersinger. And for Wagner fans, yes, the Meistersinger von Nuremberg is exactly about this type of culture. The Meistersinger was active in 14th century through 16th century. And the Meistersingers were actually guilds. Like, you had to apply for entry, you had to practice, you had to study, you had to prove yourself to join these guilds of middle-class poet singers who held competitions in churches to see who could fit the best new poetry to old melodies. So these Meistersingers would take the melodies of Minnesingers and Spruchdichters, and they would take those melodies and put their own poetry with those melodies. So the Meistersingers weren't writing new songs. They were writing new poems to go with old songs. And their performances were judged by people called Mercurin. You don't really have to know that, but I want you to appreciate how strict the process was, that these Mercurin determined whether you were good enough to compose your own melody. If you became good enough at writing poetry and setting it to other people's songs, then you were allowed to write your own melodies and join the Meistersinger Guild. Okay, does everyone feel good about that? I'll take it as a yes. Okay. So with our last few minutes, I just want to throw out again this idea that music is functional, and we've talked a lot about the vocal side of it. Let's talk about the instrumental, i.e. dance side of it. So dance music was binary, A-B forms. I don't think I need to elaborate on A-B. You guys are all pretty intelligent. And why? Because it's predictable, so that people could keep moving without getting tripped up by an unexpected section of music. Same reason we have a steady tempo and strong rhythms with easily discernible downbeats, because you have to remain predictable. They usually do what we call paired dances. So they would pair a slow dance with a fast dance, and they would play the slow dance first as kind of a warm-up, and then a fast dance so people could cut loose. So we have these dance pairs of like Passamezzo and Saltarello, or Pavane and Galliard. You don't need to know those names, but you need to know that paired dances were a thing. And this is where instruments come in. So in the last couple minutes, I've included a bunch of pictures of medieval instruments that I'll go through with you. But let's talk about how we classify these things. Medieval instruments were not classified according to musician or instrument families the way we do now. They didn't think of them as strings, brass, reeds, whatever. They classified them according to what they call haut, loud, versus bass, or soft. So you either had a loud instrument or a soft instrument, and there was nothing in between. And these instruments were put together to create layers of polyphony. So for our purposes today, it's really easy to talk about them with the Hornbostel-Sachs system. And that's a way of classifying instruments by the method of tone production. You don't have to get into the Hornbostel-Sachs system intensely, but I just want you to know that there are 4 types of instruments. There are aerophones, in other words, things that you blow into; chordophones, in other words, strings; membranophones, things with a membrane or skin that you pound on, like drums; or idiophones, which are just things that make sound themselves. Like if I have a wooden block that doesn't have a membrane and I hit on that wooden block, it makes the sound itself. So that's an idiophone. Does everyone feel good with those different types of instruments? Okay, so with our final minute, I just want to show you some pictures of very popular medieval instruments. So the aerophones. We've got haut aerophones, loud ones. Basically today, what we would think of as brass and double reeds. So here are some brass instruments of the Middle Ages that were the zinc, or cornetto, and the serpent. This bad boy was actually called a serpent. Now, bass aerophones were generally flutes and organs. In terms of chordophones, we have the rebec and the vielle. We can pluck strings like the lute or theorbo and its cousins from the Middle East. And each of these plucked string instruments has what we call multiple courses, and that's just a fancy way of saying many, many strings. We can also strike string instruments like the dulcimer or zither, and this weird looking son of a gun called the hurdy-gurdy, which is kind of a combination, because what happens is you turn this little knob here And it creates a drone by rubbing up against and bowing these strings. Then you press these buttons and it's almost like pressing down on the fingerboard of a violin. So you're both droning and pressing down at the same time. So there's my chordophones, and finally, membranophones, drums. So these pictures are all here for your heck of a name. Yes, isn't it fun? So these are all here for your perusal. If anybody has any questions, please just let me know. Does anyone have questions before we wrap up for today? Okay, thank you guys. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the week. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hey, I have
Thank you.
a bit of a question for you. Hello?
Yep, I'm right here.
Okay. So with the check-ins and that kind of stuff, because I know Blackboard, I can still use Blackboard and primarily do whatever I can to turn into content that way, but in case that doesn't work in case that doesn't work out, are you okay with me sending all of that stuff via email or something?
Let's try Blackboard. If Blackboard is working for you, let's stick with that for now.
Okay.
Have you experienced troubles with it so far?
A little bit, which is why I'm trying to figure out what's going to work best now so we can prevent bigger problems from arising.
What's it telling you right now? Because maybe I can help you work through it.
Right now it's just the way that like VoiceOver and Google Chrome are working together on Blackboard. So it's making it a little bit hard, just a bit.